Good evening. Welcome to the latest webinar in the Atlas Society's Monday Night Philosophy Series. I'm William R. Thomas, the MC for tonight's webinar. Tonight's webinar is the fourth in a five-part webinar series by Alexander R. Cohen. The series is called Objectivism, a Rational Philosophy for the Hero in Your Soul. It's a new, brief survey of the philosophy that Ayn Rand founded. Now, the course began April 22nd with Session 1, that was Living for Yourself, and it continued April 29th with Session 2, Focusing on Reality. And last week, on May 6th, we enjoyed Session 3, Values and Virtues. And all three of these webinars were recorded, and they're available on our website in the Objectivism Webinars section, or in the case of the most recent one, it will be there shortly. In this lecture, Alexander R. Cohen will emphasize Objectivism's profound commitment to the value of the individual, which implies that political philosophy must begin with radical questions. What makes living in a society valuable to an individual human being? And what foundational principles make for a society best suited to good human life? From this basis, Alexander will be able to go on to discuss the need for government and the need for objective law. And I hope all of you all return next Monday, May 20th, for the final session in this course, Spiritual Fuel, in which Alexander will discuss the role of art and of friendship in life. Alexander R. Cohen, the instructor for the course, is the managing editor of the Atlas Society's Business Rights Center and an associate scholar at the Atlas Society. And you can read his blog and other articles on business rights on our website. He earned a bachelor's degree in broadcast journalism at American University, and he holds a law degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and he's gone on to do extensive graduate work in philosophy at the City University of New York, the University of Virginia, and even in the Atlas Society's graduate seminar, where he served as an instructor as well as a student. Now, the webinar will begin with a slideshow and a live video presentation, which will run on the order of 40 or 50 minutes. And after that, there will be an open question and answer session, which will run as long as people stay connected and seem interested in the discussion. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Alexander Cohen on individual rights and the nature of government.
Tonight, I am talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In a way, that is what this whole series is about, your freedom to live for yourself and achieve your values. Tonight, however, is dedicated to individual rights, the principles that enable human beings to live freely and happily in a society. Last week's subject was ethics. In that webinar, as in the webinars before it, I spoke about what an individual needs to do and be in order to live a fully human life, to survive, to flourish, and to be happy. In moving to politics, we switched to talking about what a society needs to do and be. Moral philosophy exists to guide an individual. Political philosophy exists to guide a political community. But this is still objectivism, and every aspect of objectivism has a common purpose: to enable you to live your own life in reality, to survive, to flourish, to be happy. Even the objectivist politics has that purpose. Always and in everything, objectivism holds that your life belongs to you, and that the good is to live it. This is the principle that sets you free to pursue your values and to achieve your happiness. That means that if government is justified at all, it must be justified by what it does for you, the individual. You are the valuer who must decide whether government is worth having. Your life supplies the standard and purpose of value, which government must contribute to if you are going to value it. And not just government, but society itself must be justified to you, the individual. If it is a good idea for you to live in society, it can only be because you are better off living among other human beings than alone. You don't have to justify your existence or your pursuit of your own happiness to society, to government, to anyone. At most, you need to justify your relationships to those people you choose to have relationships with, because their lives belong to them, just as yours belongs to you. The objectivist approach to politics can be summarized by twisting a famous quotation. Ask not what you can do for your country till you know what your country does for you. As with all values, it takes action to gain and keep a good society. And when we see what a free society does for its members, we'll see that it's worth an effort to gain and keep one. The Founding Fathers were right to create this country. Immigrants, such as Ayn Rand, were right to come here. And it is worth it for them, and for everyone who chooses this country, to fight for its freedom. And for those who choose other countries, or can't escape them, there is a real value to be sought, even at great cost, in achieving and protecting your country's freedom. But we can't know that just by looking at the social or national level. Only an individual is an end in himself. Only you are the goal of your life. And if your country is to be worth anything, if its freedom is to be worth anything, it must be because of what it does for you. So, what makes it worth living in society? Society is a bunch of people, most of whom you don't know. Here's a bunch of random Americans gathered in Times Square to celebrate the Allies' victory over Japan and the end of World War II. You don't know these people. Some of them may be robbers, pickpockets, murderers, and they all have free will. They could decide to turn criminal at any time. Why would you want to live with these people? Why not hide yourself in a cabin in the woods? Shoot anyone who comes near. Is it just because you can't think of a wilderness where you could hide yourself? Or is there really some value to be found in living in a society with other human beings? Well, for one thing, some of these people may know things you don't know. Actually, every one of these people knows something you don't know, but some of them may know things that you'd actually benefit from learning and that they'd be willing to teach you. I said, why not hide in the woods and shoot anyone who comes near? Well, how would you even know how to live in the woods without others to help you learn? You'd have to figure every single detail out for yourself. And there's a lot of knowledge involved in living in the woods. So that would take time, maybe even more time than you had before you really needed that knowledge. And many of these people have skills you don't have. If you want to hide in the woods with a gun, where did you get that gun? Most likely, if you want a gun, you need to buy it. That means other people will have made the gun. Lots of other people, actually. After all, no one knows how to make a gun from scratch. If by from scratch you mean by first finding the ores, then mining them, then creating the right alloys, molding them into parts, assembling the parts, etc., plus all the logistical tasks involved, plus running the companies that do all these things, how then do you end up with a gun? All by yourself in the woods, you don't end up with a gun. But in society, if you want a gun and the government doesn't get in the way, you do end up with a gun. You get it because you create some other value, and someone pays you money for that, and you buy a gun. And when you buy that gun, you pay indirectly for the tiny portion you need of the work of all the people whose specialized efforts and specialized skills went into creating that gun. You pay for the miner, who probably doesn't know how to run a company, and for the mining executive, who probably doesn't know how to wield a pick very well, and so on. And because you are getting your gun, your food, your entertainment, and all sorts of other goods and services by trade for the few specific services that you provide, you can spend your time on making those services as valuable as you can in order to use them to buy all the other things that you want. Of course, for that to work, you don't just need a bunch of people with skills you don't have doing work you can't do so you can buy their product. You also need a bunch of people who don't have skills that you do have, but who have the money earned with their skills with which they are willing and able to pay for what you produce. More generally, society is full of other people with whom you might establish relationships, all kinds of relationships. You might work for someone or hire him, buy from him or sell to him. You might find friends or even fall in love with someone. Whatever kinds of relationships you want in your life, you need people to form those relationships with. And the more people there are around you, the more people there are who might turn out to be the people you want to know. And yet, as I mentioned, people are also potential threats. That is to say, they might interfere with your life. They might stop you from living, or from living the way you want to, or from keeping and using the goods you've produced. In short, there's a lot of potential value in living in society, but there's also a lot of potential danger. The great task of political philosophy is to specify the terms of social coexistence under which people can live fully human lives in society. If you are going to have a fully human life in a society, what you fundamentally need to do is live. And since a human being lives by thinking for himself and acting on his judgment, you need to be able to do that in society, to live by your own independent judgment. As I discussed last week, independence doesn't exclude considering what others have to say, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, being able to take into account what others say is one of the great advantages of living in society. And as I've mentioned in earlier webinars, human beings live by creating the values that sustain our lives, notably including material values, or in other words, stuff. So in society, we need to create values, we need to keep them, and we need to use them. And of course, one of the great advantages of society is the opportunity for trade. We need to use the values we create to trade with other people. And we need to be able to do all of this for the purpose of our own lives, in order to survive, in order to flourish, in order to be happy. Beyond this, we need to see the world as open to our action. Just as we need to see the physical world as a place where we can act effectively, if we're going to live in society, we need to see the social world as a place where we can act effectively. That means we need to be able to understand it and to predict the results of our actions. And it means we need to see society not as a dungeon with threats around every corner, where we must live in a constant state of fear, but as a safe place where we can expect benefits and opportunities rather than harms. Since we need to do all these things, we need other people, all those other people we're in society with, to refrain from interfering with our doing these things. For example, when we create things, we need other people not to take them away. And because we recognize the value we gain from having neighbors who are doing well, we want others to do all these same things that we need to be able to do, to live by independent judgment, and so forth. The list on my left the list on the left may look a bit familiar, especially if you recognize the document on the right, the United States Declaration of Independence. The principles of rights are the principles we need society to recognize in order for us to live and flourish in it. And the major rights Rand mentions correspond to the 4 items with the blue dots. The fundamental right is the right to life, the right to engage in the process by which a human being sustains himself. At one level, that means your biological processes, but it also means all the activities that go into a fully human life, and that's why the other rights follow from it. Since man lives by acting on his independent judgment, you have a right to liberty, to the freedom to think and act on the basis of what you think. Since man lives by creating values and then using them, or trading them for other values and using those, you have a right to property. This, of course, is not mentioned explicitly in the list in the Declaration of Independence, but it's mentioned in two corresponding lists in the Constitution. And since your goal in living is to live a long, full, and happy life, you have the right to pursue your own happiness, the third right in the Declarations list. I want to take a moment to talk a little more about two of these rights. First, the right to property. The right to property is based on the idea, which we've seen already in this series, that human beings create value, and that in order to live, we need to create value and then use it. And as I said, we need to do that in society as well, without other people interfering. So we have a right of property, which is a right to keep, control, and dispose of what we create. The right to property makes the virtue of productiveness effective in society. And of course, it makes it possible to trade the products of one's work. That means it both protects our ability to do what we would need to do even outside society, to create values and use them. It also makes possible some of the greatest advantages of society. A lot of the division of labor is possible only because of property rights. And without property, you could have very little effective liberty. For example, you can't live the way you want in your home if you don't have the control over it that property rights give you. You couldn't invite the people you want and exclude the people you don't want, for example. In fact, when anything is not private property, it is difficult or impossible to find a principled way of resolving disputes over it. For example, most streets are not private property. And that means there are all sorts of arguments about who can use them for what. Are people entitled to have protest marches? Are they entitled to park food trucks wherever they want? Are bicyclists entitled to use traffic lanes? A private owner would be entitled to decide such questions however he wanted, and would presumably do so in the most profitable way. But the government seems to be impeding liberty whenever it says no to any of these uses. And yet these uses may interfere with uses that other people want to make of the streets. A march may require closing the street to traffic. The crowds at food trucks may get in the way of pedestrian traffic. Cyclists often can't go as fast as drivers would like to. And if they're in the traffic lanes, they reduce drivers to bicycle speeds. Because the streets are publicly owned, all these issues end up being addressed politically, and no one has a solid claim of right. Like the Declaration of Independence, Rand and other objectivists talk about the right to the pursuit of happiness, but this seems a bit different from the others. Liberty and property seem to name distinct realms of action. We can, at least in many cases, spot a liberty violation without thinking about property, or a property violation without thinking about liberty, at least prima facie. For example, if the government prohibits you from drinking alcohol for non-medicinal purposes, that's a violation of liberty. And if it takes your house, that's a violation of property. But any violation of the right to pursue happiness also turns out to be a violation of liberty or property. But in fact, rights principles always interact. My liberty to drink alcohol, for example, can't be exercised unless I first come to own alcohol. And ultimately, all rights are aspects of the right to life. Or as I sometimes prefer to say, the right to live, because what rights protect is the activity of living. What the right to pursue happiness emphasizes is your right to live for your own sake. It calls our attention to the fact that liberty isn't just a right to decide how to serve others, and that property rights aren't just a scheme for managing quote-unquote society's assets. No, these are rights to go about living your life in the pursuit of your own happiness. So, for example, when I looked at antitrust law recently, while there were certainly violations of liberty and property rights there, What I found was most significant was that antitrust sees businessmen's freedom as something government gives them in order to maximize consumer welfare. And that means that antitrust completely rejects businessmen's right to the pursuit of happiness. If you want to follow up on the antitrust issue, I encourage you to read my essay, How Antitrust Competes Against Freedom, in the Business Rights Center section of the Atlas Society's website, or come to my talk on antitrust at this year's Atlas Summit. Every right is a right to do something, to live, to choose your actions, to gain and keep values, to pursue your own happiness. But every right is also a protection against something. It prohibits other people from interfering with the things that you have a right to do. Specifically, rights prohibit the initiation of force, and they prohibit fraud. Force and fraud both prevent you, or at least impede you, from using your judgment to pursue your values, which is, of course, how a human being lives. Sometimes, force comes in the form of direct force. If I break your arm, that gets in the way of a wide variety of actions, including the basic functioning of your body. If I put you in chains, that also prevents you from taking any number of actions to advance your life and achieve your values. And if I take your property, I am taking away a value you have already achieved and preventing you from using it as the basis of a future action. If I threaten you, you do have a choice, in a way. For example, if I threaten to kill you unless you give me money, you could give me the money, or try to escape, or perhaps try to kill me first. But these are all ways to avoid or minimize harm, and not, except perhaps incidentally, to gain additional values. And fraud subverts your ability to judge the facts by deceiving you. It makes it harder to use your judgment to pursue values because it causes you to misunderstand the situation that you face. Refraining from force and fraud is the only thing that your rights require of me. That's why they're called negative rights. They tell me certain things that I must not do. But they do not require me to affirmatively do anything. All I have to do is stay out of your way. But why should I refrain? The argument that I've just made is all about why you need me to refrain from violating your rights, and why I need you to refrain from violating mine. But objectivism holds that you live for your sake, and I live for mine. So if you have reason to respect my rights, and I have reason to respect your rights, that reason still has to be identified. It can't just be that each of us needs our own rights respected, because it simply isn't the case that respecting other people's rights makes sure that they respect yours. You can't control whether other people respect your rights just by whether or not you choose to. One reason is that respecting rights is simply a matter of justice, of treating people as rational human beings who need to think and act, and in the case of property rights, of treating people as the individuals who've created the values that they own. If I want people to try to benefit me, the best reason I can give them is that I'm offering them value for value. If I'm harming them or threatening to harm them, what they need to do is minimize the cost of avoiding that harm, not maximize the help that they give me. Trade is based on the principle that every person needs to think for himself and pursue his own interests, and this is exactly the principle behind rights. That said, in cases where I'm not seeking value from my potential victim, cases where all I want is for him not to be there anymore, the argument for trade doesn't apply, at least not directly. The virtue of productiveness also weighs against violating people's rights in order to gain values from them. If I gain the values that I need by trade, then I am creating the values I need to live. That is, what I receive in trade comes from the value that I've created. I'm supporting myself by creating the equivalent in value to what I consume, at least as judged by those I'm trading with in the context of their own lives. Pride, as you may recall last week, is the virtue of working on one's own good character, and that's relevant here as well. If I want to find opportunities for trade, I need to be on the lookout for opportunities for trade, rather than opportunities for plunder. I need to approach people with mutual benefit in mind. Notice that this isn't just a reason to trade sometimes, it's a reason to stick to trade as my way of obtaining values, rather than going with trade or force as the occasion arises. Violating people's rights harms them, and I gain from dealing with people who are doing well. There's another reason not to violate their rights. The people who are most worth dealing with are smart, focused, productive people. But those are also the people it's hardest to deceive, and for that matter, the hardest to rob. If I want to be a fraud or a robber, I'll have to seek out people who have less to offer. Finally, however I act, I can expect to develop a reputation to match. And that will influence who is willing to engage in what kinds of relationships with me. If I am known as a rights violator, that'll make it harder for me to find future partners or victims. But if I am known as a source of value, that'll make it easier for me to find trading partners. Plus, I'll get the satisfaction that comes from knowing other people value interacting with me. Yet even with all those reasons, a virtuous person would normally respect rights, or at least normally respect rights. There are still two ways in which rights fall short of their goal if we treat them simply as ethical principles. First of all, in some cases, the arguments are futile. You need to be able to rely on your rights, yet some people can't be convinced, or can't be convinced in time. There's no time to argue when you're being robbed, no opportunity to argue when your house is being burgled in your absence. And even when there is time to argue, not everybody will be convinced. Consider, a very large percentage of the American population remains so unconvinced by the arguments for rights that more than half a century after Atlas Shrugged was published, they keep voting for politicians who don't agree with the principles of rights. So even if a large majority does become convinced, we can expect that some people will not be. And sometimes, even a rational individual may conclude that the right thing to do is to violate rights. Suppose, for example, that you are being chased through the woods by a bear, and you come across a cabin with a big sign that says, "Keep out," even if being chased by a bear. Do you respect property rights, or do you save your own life by violating that order? You save your life, of course, even if that means you have to compensate the owner later. You can't flourish tomorrow by dying today. Because sometimes people will want to violate your rights, you need your rights to be enforced. You need someone to stop people from violating your rights. Or if you can't completely stop people from violating your rights, you may at least need people to be deterred or forced to pay compensation. All of this requires retaliatory force. That is, it means you need someone to use force against those people who violate your rights. Who that someone is, we'll get to shortly. But for now, let's just say someone, maybe even you. The second problem is that you need everyone, or nearly everyone, to agree on what your rights are, or at least to act as if they agree. This isn't the case with the virtues. It doesn't harm you if other people aren't that productive. If they have nothing to offer you, you don't trade with them. You can just walk on by. With rights, that won't do. Consider what happens if people act on contradictory principles of rights. Take the case of patents. Rand thought that patents were a form of property right. Many people think that patents are a rights violation. Now, I don't want to get into which position is true. That's too specific an issue for this webinar. What I want to address is the consequences of disagreement if lots of people act on each view. So, first consider what happens if they agree. Imagine first a society in which patents are generally respected and enforced. In such a society, an inventor has a monopoly on selling his invention. This means that even if he's not in a position to mass produce it himself, he can sell the rights to somebody who is in that position. But this comes at a cost. When he is working on his invention, he has to be careful not to infringe anyone else's patent. Otherwise, that patent will be enforced against him, and he may not be able to profit on his invention at all. On the other hand, imagine a society in which patents don't exist. In that society, a freelance inventor who creates something it takes a lot of money to mass produce has much less to offer a manufacturing concern. He might be able to give a business that's willing to pay him first crack at the market, but as soon as that product becomes popular, others will start manufacturing it. But the flip side of this system is that while he's working on his invention, he can make free use of all existing art. So if he's good at making small improvements on existing technologies, he may be able to get a job where he looks at new products that have come out, makes slight improvements, and enables his employer to produce copies that are better than the original. But in a society where some people believe in patents and others don't, he gets to a large extent the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, if he invents something, it's liable to be copied. Maybe not as much or as easily as in the society where there are no patents, but probably more than in the society where patents are enforced. And on the other hand, if he improves on something that's patented, he risks having the patent enforced against him, so he doesn't get the benefit of the intellectual commons or the benefit of intellectual property. Much the same is true with particular property claims, even where there is agreement that the object concerned is property. For example, if each of us thinks he or she owns this mug, we have a problem. In fact, if we're sitting at a table with two mugs on it, one black and one red, and each of us thinks he owns the black mug and the other person owns the red mug, we still have a problem. It may not be a big problem with mugs, but imagine it with houses. If we each tried to act on our opinion, we'd quickly find that our property claims aren't doing us the good we need rights to do. We aren't able to control the values we've created or traded for. And similarly, even if everyone agrees that a certain sort of action would be a rights violation, if there's a dispute over whether someone did that action or not, some people might try to punish him, and others might try to defend him. Likewise, if there's a dispute over whether a proposed punishment is excessive, some people might try to impose it, and others might try to prevent them from doing so. The function of government is to secure individual rights, that is, to make them effective. Government does not create rights. Rights are principles, and indeed rights are the reason to have government in the first place. But neither are rights entirely independent of government. It takes government to make them work. The most obvious aspect of securing our rights is physically enforcing them. That is, government upholds rights not just by talking about them, but by putting physical force behind its statements. Government arrests people, keeps them locked in prison, forces them to turn over their property, even kills them. When government does its job properly, it does this only for the purpose of upholding rights. That means that if someone is inclined to violate rights, he doesn't just face argument, he faces the power of the government. And in order to make sure that government's enforcement of our rights is effective, we need to make sure that that power is overwhelming. But as I argued, rights are also not effective if they're not clear. And while the correct answers to questions about rights, like all other philosophical matters, have to be found by philosophic inquiry, since people need a working account of rights that we have in common, that account has to be supplied by government. That is, by the law that government specifies and enforces. Indeed, as to some matters, philosophy may only get us so far, and there may be a range of equally good answers that government can choose. The more clearly government specifies the law, the more an individual can know what the legal effects of his actions will be, what he'll own, what debts or damages he may owe, what punishments he may incur. And not only that, but the more effectively the government enforces the law, the more an individual will be able to rely on his rights, the more secure he'll be, and the better able he'll be to take the actions he needs in order to flourish in society. Just as government has to make rights more specific in principle, it has to apply them to individual cases. It has to decide lawsuits and determine the guilt or innocence of accused criminals. You might well ask, why should government get to make these decisions? The answer is that if government is going to enforce rights, government has to decide when, where, and how to do that. You can't just say, "Hi, I'm the government, I'm going to enforce the correct principles of rights." You have to determine what you think those are. You can't just say, "I'm going to punish guilty defendants." You have to determine who you think those are. And you have to act on your judgment. Even if some cases are adjudicated by private arbitrators, if those arbitrators' decisions are going to be enforced by the government has to determine when a properly binding arbitration has been made, because it's the government that's doing the enforcing. The point of all this is to subordinate force to reason, that is, to make sure that what is enforced is not just someone's preference, but an objective interpretation and application of the principles of rights that human beings need if they are going to survive, flourish, and be happy in a society. In other words, the function of government is to establish the rule of objective law. For government to fulfill this function, it must act by and according to objective law, and only by and according to objective law. There are three kinds of objectivity that you need government to apply in order to create a social environment suitable for humans to flourish in. First, individuals need laws that are objective in their justification, that is, laws that actually serve human needs. As we've seen, that means laws that implement rights principles. Second, you need the law to be objective in its terms. That is, one should be able to tell as clearly as possible what the law provides. There shouldn't be a lot of iffy borderline cases. And third, you need the government to apply the law objectively. That is, if you're going to rely on a law to mean in practice what it says in theory, you need officials who will apply it according to what it says, not according to their personal preferences, their feelings, or any factors that aren't relevant by the terms of the law, such as the connections of the people involved. When government goes beyond its function, that is to say, when government goes against its function, because it cannot go beyond its function without going against its function, government itself is the greatest threat to the people under its authority. When the government goes against its purpose, because of the extent of its power and the scale of its actions, it can do more damage than the private criminals or private mistake makers we need it to protect us from. It does damage when people comply with unjust laws and thereby miss out on opportunities they should have had. It does damage in response to non-compliance, when it punishes people for violating unjust laws. And it does more damage when it simply acts arbitrarily, independently of the law. And the extent of the damage is often quite severe. Government ruins lives. And precisely because we need government to be able to crush crime government is so strong that it is very difficult, effectively impossible, to resist it, except to the extent it provides legal means of doing so. Now, I talked about why we need government to protect our rights, but why do we need government to protect other people's rights? Well, the first thing is, we need our own protection to be reliable. If the government is simply inadequate to protect the other guy's rights, it's inadequate to protect ours too. If the government is biased in our favor, well, we can't rely on things remaining that way. For example, if you happen to have political connections, and government is biased in your favor and protecting your rights and not the other guy's rights for that reason, well, the other side may win someday. And moreover, an oppressive regime nurtures resentment, even if the Constitution that currently exists doesn't provide for the other side to win, for the people it's biased against to win. Well, they may win anyway. And an oppressive regime, as I say, nurtures resentment, which means that what happens next may put you in a much worse position than merely equal. For example, white South Africans aren't nearly as oppressed today as black South Africans were under apartheid, but they are indeed subject to some policies that are weighted against them. And remember, we entered society for a reason, or we value society for a reason. I shouldn't say we entered it. Every reason you need your rights respected, well, so does the other guy, for all those reasons. And the benefits that you get from society are benefits that you get from successful compatriots. That is to say, the more the other guy produces, the more he can trade with you. The more the other guy knows, the more you can learn from him. The wealthier he becomes, the more he can give you if he chooses. In all your relationships, the better the other guy is doing, the better for you, at least if these are trading relationships, relationships of free exchange to mutual advantage. And on that note, let's go to an exchange of questions and answers.
Well, I hope everyone has enjoyed this webinar, and I hope there are many interesting questions about what will serve to be a just government, why our rights should be respected, why we have these rights, what happens if there's some problem, what about your favorite government program, etc. So turning to the written questions, Bob Champion has written in saying, Governor Cuomo, in supporting controls on guns, said, no one needs 10 bullets to kill a deer. He demonstrated how the left views the Bill of Rights as a bill of needs, which it is not. I should mention that Governor Cuomo is Andrew Cuomo, the governor of the state of New York.
I'm not sure this is a particularly partisan problem. But it certainly is a mistake to think that the Bill of Rights only protects what the government thinks you need. Rights, the philosophical principles, and and for that matter, the rights in the Constitution, to the certainly to the extent that they are sound rights, are based on what human beings actually need. But they are based on the needs of a human life. They are based on protecting the rights to actions. They are based on what we need in terms of what we need to be protected against. They are not claims to whatever you happen, whatever particular things you happen to need in the judgment of government. They are claims to the process of living, of pursuing values. They are claims to protection against government. Now, there is one thing that brings up that's worth mentioning, and that is, well, probably many things, but one thing in particular I want to mention, that the rights protected by the Constitution are rights that are protected by the Constitution against the government. And we could get into issues of federalism and rights, protected versus the states, protected versus the federal government, and so forth. But the more philosophical point is that there are protections of rights against government. The basic philosophical principles of rights identify rights that we need as against government as well as against private individuals. So, for example, I have a right not to be murdered by the government. I also have a right not to be murdered by will. It's the same right. And the process of implementing that is going to be different in the two cases. And that comes from the nature of government. Government needs to be structured in such a way that it keeps itself within its limits. The Constitution is an attempt to do that. Government also has the task of protecting us against one another, and that's the job of various statutes and various principles of common law. So, for the most part, the Constitution exists to protect us against government and to empower government to protect us against one another. For the most part, there is the 13th Amendment prohibition of slavery, which can be construed as prohibiting a private action. But even there, its effect on a private individual is only through various laws. There's no clause in the 13th Amendment to punish private individuals who try to hold one another as slaves. So, yeah, the government, the Constitution exists both to empower the government to protect us from private individuals and from foreign powers, and to try to protect us from the government itself. There are many people, of course, who criticize the Constitution on various rights grounds. The Constitution is not perfect. I think any rational person can see that. And the framers are no exception. The framers could see that. But to those who condemn the framers on that ground, my response is, consider that writing a constitution is basically a technological project. It is a project of figuring out a system for implementing principles. Yes, there is room to exist, there is room to improve on past art in the field of constitution writing. That doesn't mean that the existing constitution is no good whatsoever. It means there's room for improvement.
All right. Right now, the only written question we have is a follow-up from Bob Champion saying, does not the argument of protecting Alexander from Will murdering him give credence to Cuomo's argument, namely that we shouldn't really have gun rights? I suppose this is back to, do gun rights make it easier for people to murder people?
In one sense, having a gun makes it easier to kill people, justifiably or unjustifiably. It empowers the individual to make a first judgment as to whether or not to use lethal force, because he's got lethal force literally in his hand. Now, government, there's a wonderful saying that when seconds count, the police are minutes away. And for that reason, there are circumstances in which it is very useful to be able to defend yourself rather than relying on the police to come and to protect you. So, given the value of self-defense, I think there is a very good reason to have a right to bear arms. Moreover, as has often been pointed out, the Second Amendment doesn't just permit us to arm ourselves against private criminals. It permits us to arm ourselves in the event that we need to take up arms against government itself. That is to say, it makes possible revolution. Is revolution compatible with the principle that government must be able to overwhelm other powers? Well, sure, if the balance is such that it takes overwhelming consensus, or at least a very large failure of legitimacy to make an insurrection possible. Now, is insurrection a good idea? Considering how costly it is, insurrection can only be a good idea when absolutely every other means is exhausted. That is to say, when you can't vote the bums out, when you can't make arguments to get rid of them, when you can't hold a strike a la Atlas Shrugged and change things that way, yeah, conceivably things could get bad enough and desperate enough that you would turn to that. And there's one other point I think that needs to be borne in mind when we talk about issues of constitutional rights. And that pertains to the distinction between philosophical rights, which are the rights I was talking about today, and constitutional rights, which are rights as secured by a particular law, namely a constitution, or by a particular kind of law. And in the U.S., when we refer to constitutional rights, we principally mean rights under the Constitution of the United States. And once you're talking about a constitutional right, a rule of law issue comes into play. And that is that if you can't count on the government to abide by the rights in its constitution, even rights that maybe are inadvisedly placed there, then it's difficult to count on that government to abide by any other rights that constitution may protect, even the most important ones. So, that is why it's one reason that it's important to think about things like the right to trial by jury, in addition to the actual value of that right. And if you happen to think that the Second Amendment was a mistake, and even if you're right that the Second Amendment was a mistake, the fact is that the Second Amendment is in the Constitution of the United States, and therefore if we want to be able to rely on the federal government to abide by the Constitution of the United States, one of the things that means is abiding by the Second Amendment. And for anybody not an American who doesn't get this, the Second Amendment is the U.S. constitutional amendment that says we have a right to bear arms. Sorry, I should have said that first.
Well, thank you, Alexander. Moving on from gun rights, we have a general question from Mercedes Azuria. She writes in to say, can you illustrate how government does not go beyond its function, but rather goes against it? I would like to use that in debates. Also, great talk.
Thank you, Mercedes.
Mercedes is actually asking, how does government go against against its essential function?
Government goes against its essential function when it sets itself up to violate our rights. So, for example, when government prohibited, in the United States, prohibited alcohol, that would be a case of government going against our rights, going against our freedom to produce and trade values that people wanted and that contributed to their enjoyment of life. And that was government going beyond its function. That is to say, it was doing something more than protecting rights. But by doing that, it necessarily went against its function, because it went and used force for a purpose other than enforcing rights, which means it used force in violation of rights. In violation, that is, of philosophic rights, when it did things like arrest people for possessing alcohol or destroy their stock of alcohol. Mercedes, I hope that answered your question. If it didn't, please ask again and clarify.
Thanks, Alexander. Our next question is a multi-part question from Kate Jones. Kate writes in to say, who owns the air? Who owns rivers and oceans? Who owns resources underground? What rights should people have to such commons as roads, recognizing that claims to land are all based on originally acquiring them by conquest or first occupation? How do clan rights, tribal rights, national rights to territories evolve to purely private and individual rights?
Well, how they in fact evolve is a question, I suppose, of history or anthropology rather than philosophy. The philosophic question as to establishing property rights in land gets to the issue of government having a function of specifying rights. So remember that we need to be able to establish property rights in land. That's very important. One of the functions of government is to make that possible. And government makes that possible by establishing some way that people can gain private property rights in land that it has taken possession of, that it has conquered, basically. So the federal government conquers a piece of the West. It has, the Homestead Act, and it says, okay, first first we're going to divide it up into parcels. On a certain occasion, you can claim a parcel, and then if you can successfully make that parcel productive, then it becomes your property. And government thereby enables us to carry out a process of obtaining property rights in land. That is where how a lot of the property rights in land in the United States arose. Basically that pattern. And the philosophical point is that government needs to create some way for property rights to be established if they don't already exist. Now, of course, in some cases, you have property rights that already exist by custom, and government can just recognize them. But sometimes, when you've got land acquired by conquest, that is how you can proceed. and put things on a good on a philosophically good foundation. So what rights should people have to such commons as roads? Well, the standard objectivist answer, of course, is that roads should be privately owned. I myself actually have to admit I have some doubts. But what I pointed out earlier is that if you don't have private ownership, then you have a mess. And that is true. That said, it is the function of government to make to make sure that the environment is such that it is possible to go and run a business. It is not the function of government. In fact, it's a violation of people's rights for the government to go around saying who gets to run a business. Or take cycling. I ride a tricycle. That thing is slow, certainly by comparison to a car. The law says I can ride it in the traffic lanes. When I ride in the traffic lanes on my trike, that slows people down who are driving. On the other hand, if you say that I may not ride in the traffic lanes and you don't provide a cycling lane or permit me to ride on the sidewalk, then you're saying that I can't get around the streets of Washington by means of the best means of transportation I have. Well, that's a problem. How are you going to reconcile that in principle? I think the best answer is to permit cycling in the traffic lanes until and unless the government creates separate cycle lanes. But the answers are not nearly as clear-cut as a system of private property rights allows for. As to air, well, you get a very similar problem. Because you have to figure. Well, actually, I think I don't want to go there. Let me just stop. But yeah, whenever you have a commons, you do have serious problems deciding how to use it. Private property saves you from those problems. Gives you a clear-cut answer. The owner decides.
Thank you, Alexander. We have a question and a correction of that question from Professor Jeffrey Borrowdale. Welcome back, Jeffrey. Well, I guess we'll just read both questions and see. That'll help with understanding, I hope.
Actually, I think the corrected version is fine.
Oh, it's just typed. Okay. Although epistemologically, rights may be derived objectively from human nature and the human situation, doesn't their recognition and protection depend on convincing a majority of their legitimacy?
Yes, the philosophical case that we need our rights respected and protected is philosophically true. If I took this webinar text and I went and I delivered this text in Pharaonic Egypt, assume I translated it, I would be speaking the truth. I would probably be killed, but I would be speaking the truth. But it's a significant fact that I would probably be killed. If rights are going to be effective, then you need mechanisms to enforce them. And if those mechanisms are going to be effective, they need a high degree of public support. And in fact, when you try to impose even correct principles without public support, or at least without a public acceptance that the means by which they're being imposed is legitimate, you can undermine the legitimacy of the regime. So there are a lot of people who think a lot less highly of American law and of the Supreme Court because of Roe v. Wade. Because they don't think that that was really, an interpretation of the Constitution. They see it as an imposition of the Supreme Court's opinion on a contested question, and on a contested question where they believe the court got a horrendously wrong answer. Now, the court's answer was, of course, correct as a moral question. Whether or not it was correct as a constitutional answer. But, it undermined the institution because it lacked that popular support, and also, of course, because the population didn't swing around behind the court in the way that it did with Brown v. Board, which was the case that held that you could not have racially segregated public schools and ultimately racially segregated public facilities, that is, government facilities.
Thanks, Alexander. By the way, Mercedes wrote in saying thanks a lot for the answer. It's very helpful. We also have a question here from Christina Stagg. Christina asks, would you view the government's actions, which mix church and state, as the government going against its essential function? She says, for example, allowing in God we trust on the currency, or permitting Eisenhower's Congress to add under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, or holding high school graduations in church buildings.
Well, I think the first problem with the Pledge of Allegiance is that the government has one. That's the first problem. That the government is out there pressuring people to affirm a belief in anything, even the government itself.
If I can just comment, the Pledge of Allegiance was a private creation, and it was private for quite some time before the government got its grubby hands on it.
Private Pledge of Allegiance is not to the point. The point is we have a government Pledge of Allegiance that sits in the statute books, that we have various government mechanisms designed to encourage people to recite, most notably in the public schools. Of course, the public schools are a huge question right there, and a huge question to which the obvious answer is no. So, I think the problem with all that is a lot bigger than whether the word God got tucked in there. Consider what the Pledge of Allegiance was originally meant to say, and actually the phrase under God gets in the way of this. It said, one nation indivisible. And the point of that was to repudiate the idea of secession. The idea that you could divide the country. Well, the legitimacy of secession is a question worthy of debate. It certainly, and so you've got the federal government using the pledge to, well, in the period between the adoption of the pledge and the insertion of under God, when people started missing this point, I think, you had the federal government using the pledge to indoctrinate people on a political question. You have the always troubling problem of, with liberty and justice for all. If that's not if that isn't intended as aspirational, a lot of people are looking at that and going, well, that's not what I see. A lot of people, including perhaps many of the students in the schools, as to, may see it as not actually the case. Now, in a way, I feel like I'm kind of evading the question here, because the question was supposed to be about saying in God we trust, and that sort of thing.
Church and state.
So, the church and state question. And there, so let's talk about something that government does have the authority to do. Presumably, government has the authority to decorate its courthouses. Government needs, we need government to run courts. Courts need places to sit. Presumably, if you can occupy a space, you can decorate it. So what about in God we trust on a courtroom wall? Clearly the government has a right to put something on a courtroom wall, or has the legitimate power. Using the word right there is technically imprecise. But it's okay for the government to put up e pluribus unum over the judge's head. Is it okay? It's okay for the government to put up liberty behind the judge's head. Is it okay for it to put in God we trust? Well, government's function is to uphold rights. There is an argument that was very familiar to the founders that it is a violation of somebody's rights to force him to to pay money towards the promulgation of views, and especially religious views, that he thinks are wrong. That, in fact, is the purpose of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. That's why we have an Establishment Clause in addition to a Free Exercise Clause in the First Amendment. That is to say, the First Amendment separately prohibits the government from interfering with your religious activity and from sponsoring religious activity, or creating an established church. And I think it's at least a reasonable claim that you should not have the government promoting such ideas independently of whether they're true or false. And of course, if you were here a couple of weeks ago, I got into the issue of that these particular beliefs are false.
We have a last-minute question.
We
Some
have
thanks
Jeffrey
from various
Borrowdale
people.
asking me for my other talk.
Said Jeffrey Borrowdale, Professor Jeffrey Borrowdale, writes in saying, could you contrast Rand's theory of rights with natural law theory? Righto.
Okay. First of all, I actually think that what's most important is the similarity between the objectivist account and the natural law account. That is, that both are looking to human nature for the substantive guidance. That's what distinguishes natural law theory from plain old divine command theory that says God said so and therefore it's so. Is that natural law theory is the theory that says we have to obey God. To know what God wants, we have to look at human nature because God created us. And so from human nature, we derive knowledge of moral and political principles. The great, the great figure, of course, in the history of natural law, the preeminent figure is Thomas Aquinas, who is one of the few philosophers whom Rand praised. And also, I think very important, particularly in the history of how natural law evolved to where we are, or where we were in 1776, is, of course, John Locke, whose natural rights theory is sometimes distinguished from natural law theory, but I think is basically a natural law theory of individual rights. That is to say, he says God wants, he says we have to do what God commands. We can read God's commands in nature, emphatically including our own nature, and based on that, we can say we have certain rights as a matter of God's law revealed through nature. The obvious difference is that objectivism doesn't include God. Objectivism denies the existence of God. And even apart from the metaphysical question, objectivism has no room for the divine, for the authority of God, and no need for the authority of God, because the basis of value is in your life. That is, man's life is a standard of value, your life is its purpose. And so, as I went through it today, we saw how the need of certain rights principles in order to support, in order to make it possible for you to live and flourish in society, in order to make society worthwhile, in order to make government worthwhile, to you, the goal of your own life supplants God in the objectivist system. And that is really the key contrast, that where natural rights and natural law say that the ultimate basis is divine authority, we say your life belongs to you, and that's the basis. And I think that is actually the right note to close on. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for your questions, and particularly thank you to those people who typed in compliments to me. I appreciate it. Have a good night.